In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the structure and function of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a small structure. It weighs about 4 grams in an adult human. Since a typical human brain weighs about 1,300 or 1,400 grams, this represents less than 1% of the brain by mass. It lies in the heart of the brain, as shown by this animation here, and although it's small, it plays a role in a number of important functions. It regulates homeostasis, body temperature, hunger, thirst, circadian rhythms, sleep and wakefulness, and reproductive function. It also can influence your emotional state, and it plays a role in memory. To do this, it receives input from many different brain regions, as well as from humoral, blood-borne factors, such as glucose or other hormones or metabolites. It acts by not only signaling other cells in the brain, but also by activating the endocrine, the hormonal system, and the autonomic nervous system. Well, let's look at a conceptual diagram of how the hypothalamus does this. So here's the hypothalamus in the center, the heart of the brain, right? It's receiving input from many other brain areas, but especially the cortex and then parts of the limbic system, such as the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hypothalamus also gets a lot of sensory input, and this can come from the visual senses, the chemical senses, but also from somatic senses, including visceral inputs such as stretch in the stomach or blood pressure. In addition to these neural signals, there are humoral signals, so these blood-borne chemicals that can feed into the hypothalamus. What the hypothalamus does with this information is to compare it to biological set points. The classic example of one of these set points would be body temperature. Mammals maintain a constant body temperature of 37 degrees. So if you go outside in the winter and you get cold, the hypothalamus can get this information, notice that your body temperature is starting to drop, and then coordinate a number of responses to correct the situation. There are also set points for other kinds of functions, such as for body weight. In this example, you might be eating a fabulous meal and you'd be getting chemical and visual information about the magnificence of the meal, but you could be getting signals also about your stomach being stretched and the fact that there's been a spike in the levels of glucose in your bloodstream, and your brain could be reminding you that your belt's already getting a little tight, and the hypothalamus will take all of that information and compare it to the set point and then modulate behavior. The hypothalamus has a number of different outputs. It can provide feedback to other brain areas. It can also activate the autonomic nervous system, shifting the balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic arms. And finally, it can coordinate the release of hormonal signals. The hypothalamus releases a number of hormones itself, and it also releases releasing hormones, which can then trigger the release of other hormones from the pituitary. Well, now that you have a sense for how the hypothalamus works, let's take a closer look at the structure. Well, here we're looking at a mid-sagittal view of a human brain, and the hypothalamus is the area I just highlighted in red. Just to orient you, the cerebral cortex and the corpus callosum are up here. We see the cerebellum here, and then the brainstem with the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. I'm going to zoom in on the area surrounding the hypothalamus so we can look at the structures in more detail. The hypothalamus is separated from the thalamus by this sort of imaginary sulcus, the hypothalamic sulcus, so that the thalamus is lying up here. We can think about the hypothalamus as looking a little bit like a cube. If we do that, the front, anterior, top edge would be set by a bundle of fibers. We're looking at it here in cross-section, and this is the anterior commissure. There would be a band of axons that are running across between the two halves of the brain, serving as a useful landmark for the front of the hypothalamus. There's another fiber tract, the fornix. Remember that I said that there's a lot of information coming from the limbic system, so this is a fiber tract coming from the hippocampus, which will dive down into the hypothalamus itself. Here's yet another nerve. This is one of the cranial nerves. This is the optic nerve, bringing information into the brain from the eyes. We've got 2 eyes, so we have 2 optic nerves, and they cross at a structure called the optic chiasm, which lies at the base underneath the hypothalamus. Here's another structure, and looking at it, you might think it's another cranial nerve, but this is the infundibulum. This is the stalk that's going to connect the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which, if it was present, would be lying here. It's broken off in this dissection. Now we've talked about the roof of the hypothalamus, the front of the hypothalamus, the bottom of the hypothalamus. What defines the lower posterior edge of the hypothalamus? And a good landmark here are the mammillary bodies. These are parts of the hypothalamus that lie at the backmost and lowermost part of the hypothalamus. Well, let me show you a different image. This is now a ventral view. We're looking at the lower surface of the brain. And here's that structure, the optic nerves with the optic chiasm that I told you about. We can't really see the infundibulum here because it's broken off, but it would be about right here. And then these two bumps back here, those are the mammillary bodies. So this structure lying between the front of the optic chiasm and back to the mammillary bodies, that corresponds to the hypothalamus. Now I'm going to show you some sections, some coronal sections through the hypothalamus, beginning with one right here. If we were to take a frontal section through the brain, it would look like this. I'm going to zoom in and show you just the area around the hypothalamus, so we will not be seeing most of the cerebral cortex. Well, here's the first image I want you to look at, and this is taken from the front part of the hypothalamus. We see non-hypothalamic structures. Here's part of the basal ganglia and the lateral ventricles lying on top. But then remember how I said there was that fiber tract, that anterior commissure that was running across the top? Well, here it is. We're catching part of it here. And down here is the optic nerves. These have not yet reached the point where they would form the optic chiasm. The hypothalamus is lying on top of them here. And we call this region of the hypothalamus, because it lies in front of the optic chiasm, the preoptic area. There are a lot of cells in this part of the hypothalamus, and most of them are sort of scattered around and there aren't discrete nuclei. There is one I want you to know about, and that's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is sitting right on top of the optic nerves, and some of the information coming from the eye goes directly to this suprachiasmatic nucleus. This part of the hypothalamus is involved in circadian rhythms. Well, let's go and take a look at a slice slightly further back. Once again, we can see the anterior commissure. This area is called the supraoptic area because here we see the optic nerves, but we can also see in the center part of the optic chiasm where the two optic nerves have crossed. This looks to me like a section fairly far back from the supraoptic area because I can also see behind it the median eminence. This is a specialization in the floor of the hypothalamus where hormones will be released. The hypothalamus itself is lying on top of it, and again I've only colored it on one side so we can look for groups of cells later. You can see here how the hypothalamus lies on either side of the third ventricle. The two clusters of neurons I want you to know about lie in the supraoptic nucleus. Be careful here because the supraoptic nucleus is not the same as the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The supraoptic nucleus contains cells that release vasopressin. Here's another important region. This is the paraventricular nucleus, and it gets its name because it lies on either side of the ventricle. Taken together, the preoptic area and the supraoptic area are often referred to as the anterior hypothalamus. Okay, let's move you a little bit further back. What do we see? Well, here we can still see the optic nerves. They're on their way to carrying the information to the thalamus. We no longer see the anterior commissure. We've moved too far back. But now we do see another structure. This is the columns of the fornix. So remember how there was input from the limbic system that was going to dive down into the hypothalamus? Well, these are the nerve tracts that are carrying that information. And these columns of the fornix separate the hypothalamus into two different regions. We can talk about the lateral hypothalamus, so the part of the hypothalamus that lies to the side. And then on the other side of the fornix, we can talk about the medial hypothalamus. The bottom part of the hypothalamus here gets its own name. This is the tuber cinereum, which is sort of a fleshy part of the hypothalamus on the bottom lying near that median eminence. And because this is the structure that we see here, we call this the tuberal area of the hypothalamus. There are a number of nuclei in this part of the hypothalamus. I'll just mention one right now, which is the arcuate nucleus, a paired nucleus that lies right at the base of the third ventricle near the median eminence. Well, I have one last section to show you at the level of the mammillary bodies. We call this the mammillary area. Well, here again, optic tracts headed off towards the thalamus. Here are the columns of the fornix, and now you can see that these tracts are going all the way down and making synapses on cells in the mammillary body. So information from the hippocampus is traveling down to the mammillary bodies, consistent with the idea that the mammillary bodies will play a role in memory. Here's the hypothalamus, and lying on top of it the thalamus. And again, there are a number of nuclei here. I'll tell you about one. The tuberomammillary nuclei, which lie sort of between the tuberal area and the mammillary body, are here. These are the only cells in your brain that produce and release the compound histamine. And histamine is important in a number of functions, including sleep-wake cycles. Well, together, these back areas are referred to as the posterior hypothalamus. Well, I know I've gone through a lot of detail here, but often you'll see figures like this, which seem overwhelming when we try to figure out what's going on. And if you remember to break it down and think about anterior versus posterior, dorsal versus ventral, medial versus lateral, you'll have a better sense for where things are. Well, now that we've talked about the anatomy of the hypothalamus, let's look in a little bit more detail about the ins and the outs. So remember that I said that one important input into the hypothalamus came from other brain areas, especially the limbic system. Well, I already mentioned one of these inputs. The hippocampus sends information through the fornix that terminates on the mammillary bodies, and this is involved in memory. There's also input from the amygdala. The amygdala is part of the brain that we associate with fear. And there's a bundle of fibers that terminates in the preoptic anterior hypothalamus, which is involved in the emotional content of memories. There's also extensive input from the sensory systems. I already told you about one example about how some information from the retina makes synapses onto the suprachiasmatic nucleus and regulates circadian rhythms. Olfaction and taste also send input into the hypothalamus, terminating in the preoptic anterior hypothalamus. And this information doesn't do with specific chemical components. Instead, it has to do with whether we perceive a food as being pleasant or unpleasant. There's extensive input from the somatic system. We get input from pain receptors. We get input from touch receptors. Remember that one of the functions of the hypothalamus is to regulate sexual behavior, and so it shouldn't surprise you that there's input from erogenous zones. We also have input from visceral receptors, stretch in the stomach, low blood pressure. This kind of information terminates in the tuberal region. And then finally, there's input from the vestibular system. One important example of this is that there's information that terminates on the supraoptic nucleus. Neurons in the supraoptic nucleus secrete the hormone vasopressin, and vasopressin is involved in regulating blood pressure. Vaso for vasculature, pressin for pressure. And so if you stand up suddenly and there's a drop in your blood pressure, your cells in the supraoptic nucleus will immediately respond to that by releasing vasopressin, which serves to increase blood pressure. There's also humoral input into the hypothalamus. And what I want you to know here is that several regions of the hypothalamus have very leaky blood-brain barriers, allowing things like glucose and hormones and leptin and metabolites access to the cells in that part of the hypothalamus. One example of this occurs here. So we're looking at a lateral view of the hypothalamus, and at the floor of the hypothalamus there's a structure called the median eminence. So in this view on the left-hand side of the figure, we're looking at a frontal view. The third ventricle is lying right in the middle, and at the bottom of the third ventricle we've got the median eminence, where there are blood vessels without barriers, and so compounds can pass back and forth freely. They lie right next to the cells in the arcuate nucleus, which are going to be involved in regulating hunger and assessing metabolic state. Things that don't normally cross the blood-brain barrier, like free fatty acids, can come and interact with those cells. Well, now let's turn and look at the outputs from the hypothalamus. So here's a cartoon summarizing it with the hypothalamus right in the middle. And what I want to do is sort of walk through the inputs, but in the reverse order. So remember how we had inputs from the limbic system? Well, there are also outputs that feed back on the limbic system. Maybe most important among these is the Papez circuit. Cells in the mammillary nucleus send their projections back to the thalamus through the mammillothalamic tract. There's also feedback to the amygdala. Other central nervous system areas also get feedback. For example, information from the hypothalamus can travel through the cortex through what's called the medial forebrain bundle. Other information travels to the midbrain. The midbrain is important for a couple reasons. First, there are autonomic nuclei there that are involved in regulating the visceral function. And in addition, output from the hypothalamus can act to modulate nuclei releasing monoamine transmitters like dopamine and serotonin. Finally, there's output from the hypothalamus to the spinal cord, And this will be important because preganglionic cells from the sympathetic nervous system and parts of the parasympathetic nervous system lie in the spinal cord. But maybe the most important output from the hypothalamus will be hormones and neuromodulators. For most biology students, this is how they get to know the hypothalamus. So again, I'll show you this lateral view of the hypothalamus, and here I want to point out that the hypothalamus is closely associated with the pituitary gland. Two sets of hormones are released from the hypothalamus that act via the pituitary. The first are hormones that act through the posterior pituitary. So there are cells in the supraoptic nuclei. Remember, those were the ones releasing vasopressin. There are also cells in the paraventricular nucleus, and these neurosecretory cells send their axons down to the posterior hypothalamus, where they release the hormone directly into the bloodstream. Other cells in the hypothalamus act by influencing the anterior pituitary. So there are cells in the supraoptic nucleus, and the paraventricular nucleus, and the arcuate nucleus that have axons that terminate down in the median eminence. These neurons release hormones into a local capillary system. It's carried to the anterior hypothalamus, where other hormones can be released. What I've told you about hormones right now is the traditional way that we look at the hypothalamus, but I also want to tell you about the function of neuromodulators as one of the outputs from the hypothalamus. So in the hypothalamus, in addition to all those nuclei, there are cells that contain the transmitter orexin. This is a peptide neurotransmitter. It also is called hypocretin. These orexinergic neurons have widespread projections. For example, they send projections to the tuberomammillary nucleus. Well, remember, that's the place where we have the cell bodies of cells that can release histamine. The orexin neurons can also innervate the locus coeruleus. That's the structure where there are the cell bodies of noradrenergic neurons that will release norepinephrine. And together, the histaminergic and the noradrenergic neurons send these widespread projections through the brain. They're particularly important in regulating levels of alertness, of arousal, and of wakefulness. In addition to these outputs, the orexin neurons can also synapse onto cells in the raphe nuclei. That produces serotonin. And they can make synapses onto some of the nuclei in the brainstem that make acetylcholine. These also have widespread projections. They do play a role in sleep-wake cycles, but also in mood and in regulating learning and memory. Yet another target for orexin neurons is the ventral tegmental nucleus. This is one of the nuclei that produces dopamine. Neurons in the ventral tegmental area project to the nucleus accumbens. That region also gets input directly from orexin neurons, and this circuit's really important in reward, so it's implicated in addictive behavior. You may remember that at the beginning of the video, I said that the hypothalamus played a role in emotional states, and one of the things I had in mind were these neuromodulatory compounds that can be released by cells in the hypothalamus. Well, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and up to this point I've really spoken about the nuclei in the hypothalamus as if they're independent from one another, but there's a lot of crosstalk and coordination between the nuclei and the hypothalamus. Let me give you an example. So remember that we have this suprachiasmatic nucleus that I said was involved in circadian rhythms. This nucleus contains neurons that are most active during daylight hours. They fire bursts of action potentials. They can activate cells in another hypothalamic nucleus, the dorsal medial hypothalamus, that in turn can send projections to a sleep-promoting nucleus in the lateral preoptic area. So if the suprachiasmatic cells are active because it's daylight outside, we'll inhibit the sleep-promoting nucleus. You won't sleep. There's also a projection from the dorsal medial hypothalamus to the lateral hypothalamus where we find these orexin neurons, and those orexin neurons then can secrete orexin onto the tuberomammillary nucleus, which again release the histamine. Now normally histamine inhibits the sleep-promoting nucleus. You can remember that because we've all had the experience of taking an antihistamine and then being knocked out. It puts us to sleep. So if an antihistamine is putting us to sleep, histamine normally would promote alertness by inhibiting sleep. Now, although the sleep-promoting nucleus can be inhibited by these functions, it in turn has reciprocal innervations back to the tuberomammillary nucleus where it releases the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA and shuts this off, so you can't stay up indefinitely. Eventually you'll fall asleep. Well, let's look at another nucleus, the arcuate nucleus. Remember, that's the one at the base of the brain that I said was close to the median eminence? Well, the arcuate nucleus has two groups of cells. I'll make them blue and red. These cells project to the paraventricular nucleus as well as to the lateral hypothalamus. One set releases the peptide neurotransmitters MSH, also called POMC, and CART, and when this pathway is activated, feeding is suppressed. The other set of cells also projects to the paraventricular nucleus and the lateral hypothalamus, but they release a different set of peptide neurotransmitters, neuropeptide Y, and agouti-related peptide, and these will stimulate feeding. Both sets of cells respond to changes in the levels of leptin. This is a small protein that's produced by fatty cells, and fat cells release leptin when they're storing energy, so when there's plenty of food around. Well, when leptin levels are high, they feed into the cells in the arcuate nucleus, and they'll activate the pathway then that suppresses feeding. In addition to this, the arcuate nucleus cells can project to the dorsal medial hypothalamus, which in turn will inhibit sleep. So if there's plenty of food around and life is good, you don't need to conserve energy by curling up and sleeping. The other set of cells responds to high levels of leptin and inhibits the pathway that would normally make you eat. Now there's also direct input from orexin neurons onto the cells in the arcuate nucleus, so this can be modulated further. And what I want you to take away from this complicated picture is that there are a lot of intrinsic circuits within the hypothalamus that are working together. And we need this. Remember, the role of the hypothalamus is to coordinate physiological responses at the level of the entire body. Although these details are complicated, they have tremendous clinical implications. I've already given you the example of the effect of taking an antihistamine. But when you look at a figure like this, you can also begin to see why individuals who are doing shift work and working at night may be particularly susceptible to obesity.